Today we are talking about movement speed. More specifically, we're talking about movement speed on assassins because those are the characters that typically have the room to invest into a lot of movement speed, and those are the characters that we typically see in the jungle. However, what I say here also applies, for example, for mage junglers for the most part, because all of them are around the same movement speed, and even if you invest into multiple movement speed items, they will typically have similar movement speed stats. As usual, there are some outlier cases, but overall this is very much applicable to most gods in Smite. The question I got asked was, is there a point where you build too much movement speed? Is it possible to overcap on movement speed and effectively waste stats that you were better off investing somewhere else? And that's what we're gonna dig into a little bit more. So first of all, yes, obviously there is a point where you're building too much movement speed, but this point can't just be determined by a single factor. There's an overarching thing in that context that you definitely should keep in mind though. And that is movement speed caps for diminishing returns. That means if you reach a certain threshold of movement speed, the movement speed that you build after that point will be valued slightly less. It will not give you the full value as if you were to build just one movement speed item, and that increases over time. If you build between 0 and 457 movement speed, you have no diminishing returns, you get that right off the bat. That is very easily reached though, because most characters start around 370, 375 movement speed already. As such, it doesn't take much to get there. As movement speed increases work in percentages, it's quite easy to go up from there. A character that naturally has more movement speed will also cap out at a higher value, but that goes down over time with the diminishing returns. So when a god builds boots plus 3 movement speed items, it doesn't really matter all too much how much the base movement speed value was, because the difference at this point will be relatively minor and it will not have a major impact anymore on how fast the god feels. The next threshold is between 457 and 540.5. If your movement speed is anywhere in this area, it will face 20% diminishing returns, meaning you get 80% of the movement speed value that you're building. If you build more than 540.5 movement speed, which is almost impossible for certain characters, then you will have a 50% diminishing returns on every bit of movement speed that you build beyond that, meaning it is hardly worth investing into more movement speed. This information was taken from Word of Thoth. Flatwood recently posted the new Season 5 version, and you should definitely check that out if you haven't yet. It's a lot of information about the mechanics, interactions of Season 5. A lot of information that is definitely helpful. But I wanted to see what specifically that means for different assassins. For that purpose, I actually used another resource, Shadow Venom's resources, who has a list of all movement speed stats of all gods. It's a little bit outdated, unfortunately, because, for example, Susano had a buff since in his movement speed and some other changes that needed that movement speed to be adjusted. But overall, it's still very representative, and that is also a resource that you can definitely check out. With the help of that, I was able to determine that pretty much all assassins either have 370 movement speed or 375. The values here are almost random. With certain gods it makes sense. For example, a Willish has 370 due to Suku, Bakasura has 370 due to his passive, I would think, but then again, Hunbatz also has 370, so maybe in some cases it's just older gods that actually didn't get the movement speed increase. But in the bigger picture, it doesn't even matter that much anyways. The only bigger outliers here are Ratatoskr, not because the stats are different, but because he has 375, but gets different movement speed stats from the Acorn as opposed to the boots, and Mercury, who has 381 movement speed just to be the fastest god in the game. I made a table here to show how the movement speed changes depending on which items you build. On the left side, you will see the gods, then you see the base movement speed stats that they have, with the ones that have some sort of outlier stat being highlighted, and then you see first Warrior Tabi, then Warrior Tabi plus a 10% movement speed item, 2 10% movement speed items, or 3 10% movement speed items, so up to 30% extra movement speed, and then the same thing for Teleria boots, or Acorn in case of Ratatoskr who can't build boots. The green parts of the table are the parts where no diminishing returns at all are applied to the movement speed. The yellow ones are the ones where diminishing returns are applied, meaning they have too much movement speed to get the 100% benefit out of all of that movement speed. They only get it until 457. Then the red ones are the one that actually overcap the second cap, meaning they get a 50% reduction of the extra movement speed at that point. What you can see here is that almost everything goes over the first cap. The only way to not go over the first soft cap is by simply just building normal boots like Warrior Tabi or Ninja Tabi and not even investing into Talaria. But with Talaria you only go slightly above the threshold and it doesn't really matter that much. In my opinion, a 20% reduction is something that shouldn't really take away from your decision, as movement speed is still such a valuable stat, so I definitely think you can still benefit from it. Even Ratatoskr doesn't reach the first cap just with his Acorn. Only Talaria will actually reach that point already. Depending on the god, it can be a little bit closer to that or a little bit further away, but really it's a very minor difference. Beyond that point, pretty much all the characters can build 3 movement speed items quite comfortably, even with Talaria. Yes, some slightly go into the range of overcapping, but it's really ever so slightly, only 4 movement speed for most of them, with the exception of Mercury, who goes 9 movement speed into the secondary cap, which really isn't that much of an issue, especially when Mercury still gets power from extra movement speed anyways. Building more than 3 movement speed items after boots is where it becomes more questionable. But even then, how often is that actually going to happen? Say for example, as Bakasura you want to build Stone Cutting Sword and you want to build Hasten Katana, and then you also need a Wing Blade against that team, you're still only building 3 movement speed items. There is no reason to, for example, build Masamune at that point. There are plenty of other options that you can go into. If you really want that little bit of extra movement speed, it's still possible, but at that point realistically, you're not looking for movement speed. And we also have to factor in something else here. We have to keep in mind that many gods still have movement speed increases after these stats. For example, Arachne gets a 40% movement speed increase through her web, meaning when she has boots, then the web alone will already catapult her into the secondary threshold. Awilish gets 25%, meaning realistically most of the time, as long as you travel on Suku, you don't really want to have more than 1 extra movement speed item, which is why I think she is one of the gods where you kinda want to avoid Talaria, because that gives you a little bit more room in that regard and you can, for example, go into 2 different movement speed items. With Bakasura you can get 10% movement speed per stack of his passive. This can be very strong, but then again the question is, do you really want to rely on the passive for your movement speed? If you do, then you only really need 1 movement speed item, being boots, and you would have enough, but you probably want to build Hasten Katana anyways. With Bastet, you get a 25% movement speed increase, but then again on Bastet I don't really see any reason to build any movement speed item other than boots and maybe Heartseeker, so it doesn't really matter all too much for her, and we see a similar picture with Loki, who gets 35% extra in stealth. These characters just have better raw power items for them anyways, so you don't really care much about their movement speed. Mercury gets an extra 10% from the passive of his 2 at max rank, but again, he's a bit of an outlier because he also gets more power that way, so I really wouldn't concern myself much with that, and you're probably gonna build into other items anyways, though you could, for example, use Wind Demon with him. If you do that and you, for example, have Talaria plus 1 movement speed item, for example, Stone Cutting Sword, plus Wind Demon for the crit and your passive, then you're already far into overcapping, but again, not really a problem with Mercury specifically. With Thanatos, you can increase your movement speed to up to 30% as well with his 2, depending on the rank of the ability. Another one of those that can strongly benefit from a little bit of movement speed, but probably doesn't benefit that much from investing fully into it, but at the same time, also a passive that isn't up all the time. That's the same question as with Thanatos and Penetration. You will have a massive amount of penetration as long as your 2 is up, but if it's ever down, then you kinda are without penetration if you haven't built into it at all. As movement speed is such a strong stat, I would generally advise to build into it whenever you can. It just allows to do so much more in team fights, especially, or juke in a single opponent. I would keep in mind that Wind Demon gives you 20%, so if you intend to build that, you might want to avoid building too much movement speed in other items, and I would generally try to keep it to 3 extra movement speed items maximum. If your character has no steroids, then increase your movement speed anyways. Overall, typically the items that provide you with movement speed are not built for the movement speed, but other stats primarily, and this should just be a secondary concern and really only comes into question when you, for example, think about late game items, for example, if you want to go into Masamune or something else. I hope this clears up any questions regarding movement speed a little more and makes the whole thing a little bit clear now that you have the numbers. And with that, thank you guys very much for watching. I hope this was informative and interesting. If you're new to the channel, feel free to click the sub button and hit the bell, it really helps me out. Other than that, see you for the next one tomorrow. Duke Sloth, out. So I actually figured out my demonetization issue and it was my outro. As such, feel free to click any of the links around here right now. There will be new outro music as soon as I find something nice. Until then, as you guys requested, I will do the outro music myself. You're welcome.